Chapter 13. The stars still spangled the sky when Ranofer woke to the pad of Gaboo's footsteps crossing the courtyard the next morning. Memory swept over him, and with a chilling knowledge of the thing in store for him today, he lay still, eyes tight shut against reality, but he could not shut out the whine of the storeroom door, the footsteps coming out again a little later, and finally the soft click of the gate. Gaboo was gone, and he must not get away this time. Ranofer rose from his mat and ran across the pavement and into the storeroom. A splash of water on his face, a thirsty swallow or two, and he was searching hastily for food. There was half a loaf and a couple of onions. Ranofer started on the bread as he left the room, trying not to picture the coming feasting in the streets of Thebes. The chances were slim that he would ever taste another honey cake. He walked quickly across the courtyard, everything in him wanting to run the other way. At the gate, he paused, his hand already on the latch, and suddenly leaned his head forward against the worn, familiar wood. He was shaking all over. I wish I were someone else, he thought. Haket, or the ancient, or Kai the baker's boy, or even a cat or a dog. Then I would not know any secrets. I would be going out to feast today instead of to some dark and fearful tomb. He was not someone else, though. He was Ranofer the son of Thutra, who loved his Pharaoh and the gods of Egypt, and wanted to be free. He took a deep breath and opened the gate. Gaboo's shanty was only a faint glimmering in the dark street ahead, but Ranofer waited until it almost disappeared before he ventured out. Keeping the pale blur just in sight, he followed it through the winding, narrow alleyways of the city of the dead and across the barren land beyond, while the sky above him turned faintly gray and the stars vanished one by one. By the time the high western cliffs were stained with the first pink of dawn, he was moving along directly below them, with the city, the flower fields, and the strip of desert all behind. Presently, Gaboo vanished into a cleft in the rock face, and when Ranofer arrived at the same spot a few moments later, he saw a winding pathway, strewn with boulders and hardly wider than a man's body, leading upward into the hills. He moved up it nervously, not liking the sharp curves which prevented him from keeping Gaboo in sight in order to assure a safe distance between them, not liking at all the walls that pressed in on either hand, with no crevices in which a boy might hide. He had passed the seventh curve and was still climbing when he heard a mutter of voices ahead. Gaboo must have arrived at the meeting place and found Wenamon waiting. Or had he encountered a guard? Ranofer crept closer, listening. May regret this day, impatient one. It was Wenamon's murmuring voice, that was certain. Gaboo's lashed back at once. Fool! Who would follow us? Even the guards of the valley will be feasting in Thebes. There was another murmur. Then Gaboo snapped, You are witless and a coward. Go look back down the path if you must. Ranofer went numb. As a footstep crunched just around the curve ahead, he whirled and scrambled straight up the rocky wall, seizing at cracks, minute tufts of grass, whatever he could get a hold of, and expecting every instant to feel a rough hand grasp his shanty. There was a narrow shelf formed by an out-thrust boulder just above the height of a man's head. Ranofer rolled himself onto it and lay as still as death. The next instant, Wenamon's cloak-wrapped figure appeared around the bend. The mason stopped, his bright, suspicious eyes darting every way but upward. He advanced it soundlessly, passing so close under the shelf that Ranofer could have touched the black plaits of his hair. He padded down to the lower curve, peered around it, and listened a long moment, while Ranofer lay rigid and sweating in plain sight above him. Then he turned, retraced his steps, and vanished around the rocks ahead. It was some time before Ranofer could gather strength to slide down to the path, and when he did, his legs were almost too weak to support him. Nevertheless, he forced them to move in the direction Wenamon had taken. In view of the miracle just past, he could almost believe the gods were protecting him. The next bend disclosed the place of the broken tree, a wide spot in the canyon-like path where a scrawny, strange-looking tree grew out of a cleft between boulders. Beyond, Gaboo's hulking back and Wenamon's stooped, narrowed one were just disappearing over a last rise. Ranofer could see now that the rise formed the summit of the western cliffs, up the furrowed and craggy face of which they had been climbing. To the east lay Thebes, spread on both sides of the swollen river like a many-figured carpet, stained in 100 delicate colors by the morning light. Beyond the rise to the west, the way opened out, and the path descended into the valley. Ranofer paused a moment, looking back upon the spread-out city. As he watched, 7 red and white pennants rose simultaneously on the palace walls, and he caught the faint squealing notes of a trumpet. It was the signal for the festival to begin. Soon the great procession would burst from the gates of the Temple of Ammon far across the river. Later, at midday, Pharaoh would come from his palace to throw open the first canal with his own hand, and the streets of Thebes would be full of food-laden tables, and joyful people spilled barley beer. And he would not be there. Perhaps he would never be there again. Ranofer wanted nothing more in that moment than to be back in the street of the Crooked Dog, or even in the stone-cutting shop, scrubbing at some block of granite with a sandstone, or chipping at a coffin lid. He bit his lip hard, turned abruptly away from the city that was his world, and started down the stony path into a world inhabited only by the dead. It stretched before him, a wasteland of glaring red hills rising from a giant's block pile of tumbled boulders, desolate, barren, and ominously still. Nowhere was there a single sprig of green. The sun had cleared the horizon now. By the time he reached the valley floor, it was beating fiercely upon his naked shoulders, reheating rocks and sands not yet cooled from yesterday, wrapping the whole valley of the tombs in shimmering, burning heat. Ranofer, threading his way among the scorching rocks, wondered in panic if he would ever be able to find his way out again. Every pile of boulders looked like every other. The cool, flooding Nile and the familiar streets of Thebes seemed as far away as stars. High above him in the brazen sky, a lone falcon wheeled. Far ahead, the figures of Gabu and Wenamon were dwarfed by their surroundings to mere swatches of black and white. 2 thieves, a falcon and himself. Except for these, not a living thing stirred in all this burning, silent world. Other things stirred, though, wraith-like things, unseen, unheard, but present in their hordes even in this glaring daylight. The baws of the dead could roam by day as well as by night, if they so chose, and would they not often wing about this lonely city of their mansions, assuring themselves that all was safe and undisturbed? Surely a footstep, sounding faintly in their dwellings far below, would bring them fluttering in anger up their shafts into this hot, still air, set them searching this way and that for the intruder. Licking his parched lips, Ranofer tiptoed nervously across the sands, wondering if preferable to the death-haunted emptiness which surrounded him now. Apprehensive and breathless, he arrived at the rock pile, stopped short, and sprang back behind it. Not 3 paces away, on the other side of the rocks, were the 2 he followed, working busily at something he had not had time to make out. He stood flattened against a hot boulder, trying to control his jerky breathing. He could hear crunching and scraping, an occasional guttural curse. Then the noises stopped, and all was still. Moments later, he dared peer around the boulder. What he saw was an irregular black crevice in the rocks ahead, and a scattering of small stones around a large one which had evidently been rolled aside. Was this the entrance to the tomb, then? It looked barely large enough to admit a man's body, much less the huge coffin that must lie somewhere below. Ranofer crept out of hiding and stood peering fearfully into the crevice. It did not look like any tomb entrance he had ever seen or heard of. Casting a nervous glance over his shoulder at the desolate valley in which he was now utterly alone, he lay down flat on the hot sand and lowered his head into the dark, irregular hole. He could see nothing for a moment, then a dimly glimpsed surface made him stretch an arm down to explore it. It was a narrow projection, perhaps a step. Wriggling forward, he eased more of himself over the edge until he was hanging head downward into the hole, with the edge cutting his waist. His groping hand touched a second projection, not quite an arm's length below the first. Another step. It was certainly an entrance of some sort. This flight of crude and uneven steps, hacked out of the rock and earth, led down the shaft. At the bottom, a passage must tunnel away toward the tomb. Ranofer wriggled backward again and got to his feet, threw another uneasy glance around him, and turned back to the crevice. He could not make it out. Never could a huge coffin have been carried down that shaft. It must be a second entrance to the tomb, a secret one. A secret one, of course! He stood transfixed by a flash of understanding. The whole of Gabu's plot was suddenly clear to him. He had heard tales of such tunnels dug out during the construction of a tomb by scheming workers. They would hack through the wall of a tomb chamber secretly, and tunnel as far as time allowed toward the surface of the earth, adding the rock chips to the other debris from the excavation of the tomb. The hole in the chamber wall would then be plastered over like the other walls, so that no passage showed at all. A few years or perhaps months later, when the funerary visits of the surviving family became infrequent, they had only to dig a shaft down from the surface to meet their tunnel. When this was done, they could enter the tomb at their leisure and cart away the gold undetected by the guards at the real entrance, which might be a quarter of a league away and out of sight behind some rocky hillock. Gaboo was a stonecutter, Wenham a mason. They had done this thing. It would be easy for them to arrange it. Ranofer caught his breath as another realization struck him. The little room in the tomb drawing, the one for Pharaoh's master of storehouses. It was no room at all. It was a passage like this, disguised so that the workmen could hack it out without knowing it was anything but another storage chamber. Small wonder Gaboo had flown into a rage when he was asked about it. Ranofer went cold all over with fright as he saw himself calmly pointing to the very place on the drawing, recklessly asking the most dangerous of all questions. It was like crawling straight into a crocodile's jaws and only finding out later that you had done it. Shaken as much by the past danger as by the present one, he huddled beside the crevice, trying to gather his scattered wits. Poor master of storehouses, he thought distractedly. When the old man finally dies, he will not have long to rest. A sudden, queer noise made him swing around. What was it? He saw no one, nothing, only the same glaring, lifeless wasteland with its tumbled piles of boulders stretching all around him. His eyes went slowly to the rock pile near at hand, behind which he had hidden a few moments ago. Was something else hidden there now? He edged closer to the crevice, still staring at the rock pile. Once more, even Gaboo and Wenham seemed companions fervently to be desired. At least they were human. They were alive. But I do not want to go into a tomb, Ranofer thought desperately. I do not want to follow them clear into that dark and awful place. Surely it is enough that I know that they are there. I can run now and give the alarm. Run past the ominous rock pile? Through all that terrible, empty valley again, alone? His flesh crawled. He shrank another step toward the crevice, and as he did so, he heard the sound again, eerily distinct and close. It was the dry rustling of wings. A cold moisture chilled Ranofer's forehead, as if an icy hand had been laid there. At that moment, a gust of wind swept across the sands. There was a loud clapping and beating, and from behind the rock pile, a huge black form with outstretched wings rose cumbersomely, tilting and flapping directly toward him. With a cry, Ranofer leaped for the crevice and slid feet first into the dark. At dawn, Haket and the ancient had arrived at the fish dock, dressed in their best and eager for the day ahead. For a time they talked together happily, admiring each other's finery, teasing, laughing from sheer excitement, and glancing up the thoroughfare from time to time to see if Ranofer was in sight. "What a lazy clod," Haket said finally, "still on his mat, today of all days. Let's go rouse him." "Do you know where he lives?" inquired the ancient. "Nay, I thought you might." "Well, I do not. We'll have to wait." They busied themselves watching more and more holiday-makers emerge from their houses and side streets as the sky pinkened above. The sound of voices and laughter swelled, and the thoroughfare grew crowded as the inhabitants of the city of the dead streamed into it and hurried toward the ferry landings. Still, Ranofer did not come. Many other boys passed by with their parents and their sisters and their aunts and cousins and grandfathers. Gilded palanquins and chariots, preceded by runners and followed by retinues of servants, began to appear from the direction of the noblemen's villas. Ferry boats and private barques were now putting out from every dock as fast as they could be loaded. Many had already reached the opposite bank, and others were strung across the river like a gala chain. The two friends waiting on the fish dock began to get restive. When the 7 pennants rose high on the palace walls, and the trumpet squealed its joyful signal, Haket turned impatiently to the ancient. "Surely he will hear that," Haket said. "Though he be sleeping like a rock, that sound will rouse him. He must come soon." "Aye," the ancient said in a somewhat dubious voice, "but I do not understand why he is not here already." "Well, anyone can oversleep." "On a festival day? An always hungry boy?" Haket shrugged, but his face was puzzled as he peered down the crowded thoroughfare in the direction which Ranofer must come. 10 minutes later, the crowds had noticeably diminished as they drained from the thoroughfare into the ferries and sailed across the river. Haket and the ancient were now frowning and uneasy. "We will miss our ferry," Haket exclaimed. "They will all be gone soon. Did not he say he would meet us?" "I know he said it. We spoke of it 100 times. Of course I did not see him after midday yesterday." "I did," said the ancient. "And did he not mention any change of plans?" "Nay, he—" The ancient's face altered suddenly. He turned and stared down the street as if staring alone would make Ranofer appear. "What is wrong, ancient?" Haket asked anxiously. "Perhaps nothing, perhaps a great deal. Tell me, young one, did he seem disturbed when you saw him at midday? Did he act a little strange, as if—" "As if what?" Haket prompted as the ancient's voice trailed off. "I do not know," the old man admitted. "I know only that when I saw him at the day's end, I asked 3 times what ailed him. He was troubled about something, very troubled." "It was that brother of his, no doubt," Haket said. "He is always troubled about that brother and his thieving." "Nay, he kept talking about tomb robbers. The ancient broke off with his mouth still open. For a moment, he and Haket stared aghast at each other. "Tomb robbers," Haket whispered. "Could he have found out Gaboo is a tomb robber?" "He had found out nothing at all, as far as I know," the ancient said agitatedly. "He told me nothing, but then perhaps he would not." "Surely he would have told you that. Still, he keeps his thoughts to himself, especially the bad ones, the ones that make him afraid." Haket's voice trailed off to, "Now what?" "Yesterday at midday I was telling him something. I had overheard a conversation, a thought. I thought he was frightened, but then he spoke so calmly, told me it all meant nothing." The ancient seized his arm. "What conversation? What was it you overheard?" Swiftly, Haket repeated the tale of the eavesdropping behind the potter's new-made jars, and what Ranofer had said of it later. When he mentioned the place of the broken tree, the ancient's one eye sharpened suddenly, but he did not interrupt, though his face grew grimmer and paler as he listened. "So you see," Haket finished, "it could have nothing to do with Ranofer. Gaboo is not even in Thebes today. No doubt the 2 cursed ones are meeting, but at that place of the tree, and if that is in Abydos—" "It is not in Abydos," said the ancient softly. "I know the place of the broken tree. It is an old, old landmark, and it is not in Abydos." His bony hand stretched out, a finger pointing toward the western cliffs. "It is there, near the summit, on the path to the Valley of the Tombs." As Haket eyed him in frozen silence, he added, "That young one knew it too, or guessed it. He asked me how those thieves were caught, the ones he saw hanging from the palace wall one day. Aye, and I told him. "What did you tell him? How were they caught?" "They were followed, straight through the valley and into the tomb, and I told him about it. I'll wager that's where he is this minute, trailing those villains across the place, with never a charm or an amulet to keep the Kefs away." "We must go after him," Haket cried. "We can catch him. Ancient, bring him back." The ancient was already hobbling down the steps of the fish dock, with his one eye fixed on the distant cliffs. "Aye, we'll catch him if we can. You're too young, and I'm too old for such a venture, little one, but he's got nobody else." "The guards?" puffed Haket as they ran into the thoroughfare. "Feasting yonder across the river with everyone else." The ancient pointed bitterly toward the midstream, where the last crowded ferryboat was bobbing toward the opposite bank. The thoroughfare was deserted, all the streets were deserted, and the shops and houses empty. It really did seem a city of the dead now. At its outskirts, they were forced to slacken their pace. Both were breathless, as much from anxiety as from their haste. The ancient signaled for a halt, and they stood puffing, the eyes of both following the road across the desert. As soon as their breathing quieted, the ancient glanced at Haket and nodded. Without a word, they started toward the western cliffs. Half an hour later, they rounded a bend on the steep, narrow path and saw the strange, stunted tree thrusting out of the cleft in the boulders. Beside it, the path broadened, and Haket caught up to walk beside the ancient. Together they topped the last rise and paused, gazing in silence out over the vast red wasteland that spread below. Haket shivered slightly and moved toward the ancient until their arms were touching. "How can we find him in that place?" he whispered. "Do you think we can find him, ancient?" "I don't know, young one. We must try." "I thought we might see him, but I see nothing alive." "One thing is alive," the old man said grimly. He pointed far across the boulder-strewn sands, where from a distant rock pile a great black vulture at that moment rose clumsily, tilting, flapping, and finally wheeling upward in a soaring glide. When it was high in the air, circling lazily against the blue, the two on the cliff path tore their eyes from it and started downward to the valley floor.
One thing is alive, the old man said grimly. He pointed far across the boulder-strewn sands, where from a distant rock pile a great black vulture at that moment rose clumsily, tilting, flapping, and finally wheeling upward in a soaring glide. When it was high in the air, circling lazily against the blue, the two on the cliff path tore their eyes from it and started downward to the valley floor.